Welcome back to the Spoken Word. My name is Travis, and I'm your host. In this episode, we're going to wrap up our discussion of atonement in Leviticus by tracing it into the Greek of the New Testament. We have learned that the Hebrew word for atonement is Kaphar, a purifying, protecting, transforming action that involves the undoing of sin rather than the satisfying of God's wrath. We've also learned how to use the Septuagint to export Hebrew words into the Greek language as a way to trace ideas from the Old Testament into the New Testament. Now we're going to bring all of that together and see how the New Testament authors thought about atonement. Let's dive in. Our study of atonement in Leviticus has been centered on the Hebrew word kaphar. This word has many different layers of meaning. If it acts upon a person, it can mean something like appeasement. We saw this use when Jacob appeased or kaphared Esau with gifts. But we also noted that kaphar never once acts upon God. This is to say that God is never the direct object of kaphar. So, whatever it is that kaphar does when a priest kaphars for a person by a Levitical sacrifice, it isn't about appeasing God. Rather, we saw that it seems to be doing something to sin and its polluting effects. Sin, it would seem, is the implied direct object in Levitical uses of kaphar. We also saw from the Day of Atonement that the act of kaphar by a priest is not at all focused on punishing an animal in place of a person. We saw that the words for punishment in the Hebrew language don't even appear in Leviticus when talking about sacrifices. Killing an animal was simply a way of transforming its life into a form that could be presented before God in sacred space and also be used as a sacred detergent to purify God's space from sin's pollution. So, when used in Leviticus, kaphar is about dealing with sin by purging it. It is not about satisfying God's wrath by killing something. Most of our English Bibles translate the word kaphar as the phrase make atonement. So when we see that phrase in our English translations, we need to train ourselves to think in these Hebrew terms. Now, how does this idea get carried into the New Testament? Remember, the New Testament is written in Greek, not Hebrew. But it was mostly written by Jews who themselves used Greek in unique ways to stand in for Hebrew ideas. We can see how they meant to use certain words by reading the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament that was around at the time of the New Testament authors. If a New Testament author used a Greek term from the Septuagint, we should look back at the Hebrew that it stood in for to get the most accurate meaning of what the author wanted to convey. We called this unique use of Greek words with Hebrew meanings Judaized Greek, a Greek vocabulary meant to be understood with a Hebrew dictionary. So, what Greek word got hijacked and redefined to stand in for kaphar in the Septuagint? It was the Greek word exilaskomai, a form of the word hilaskomai. So, if we want to look for kaphar in the New Testament, we need to be looking for forms of the word hilaskomai. Before we go digging around in the New Testament, though, there is a snag that we need to work out with hilaskomai. Hilaskomai is a verb that typically meant to propitiate, that is, to appease in Greek culture. Here's an example from Homer's Odyssey, Book 3, line 419. It says, "Quickly, my dear children, fulfill my desire, that first of all the gods I may appease Athena." Appease here is the word hilaskomai. Since the Septuagint authors used hilaskomai to translate kaphar and its related family of words into Greek, does it mean that we have been wrong all along and the Jews really did think of kaphar as a way of appeasing God? Well, no. We know that kaphar can also mean appease, just as we saw with Esau and Jacob, so it makes sense that the Septuagint authors would use this word for that commonality. But just like kaphar, God is never once acted upon by hilaskomai in the Septuagint rendition. Athena may have gotten hilaskomai'd, but God never was. Instead, we should be thinking purification rather than appeasement when a Jewish author uses hilaskomai to stand in for Kaphar in the context of atonement based on the way that it is used. So, rather than coining a new word like William Tyndale did in English with the word atonement, the Septuagint translators simply redefined hilaskomai and related words to fit their purposes. They used it in a new way that expanded hilaskomai's range of meaning to be more like Kaphar. They added a Jewish definition of hilaskomai to the dictionary, in essence. When we see hilaskomai in the Bible, we should understand it with this Judaized Greek definition, not a pagan Greek one. With all that said, and hilaskomai redefined into a Judaized Greek form, let's turn to how the New Testament uses hilaskomai. Surprisingly, it only appears twice in the entire New Testament. The first use is in Jesus' parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18:13. He said this, "But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but kept striking his chest and saying, 'God, have mercy on me, a sinner.'" The phrase "have mercy" here is actually a translation of our friend hilaskomai, which we should all start reading now thinking Kaphar. So he literally cries out to God, "Hilaskomai me." He was saying, "Kaphar me." Now that we have been trained by the Old Testament, think about what this tax collector was saying. He wasn't asking God to change God's disposition towards him, like the translation "be merciful" might imply. The tax collector was rather asking God to do something to him. He wanted God to restore, cleanse, and transform him, not merely leave him unpunished. And indeed, Jesus went on and said that something happened to the man and not God, just as we would expect. Jesus said that the tax collector went home justified, made whole and right, restored, hilaskomai'd, kaphar'd. Nothing happened to God, perfectly in line with our observation that God is never once kaphar'd in the Old Testament Hebrew or hilaskomai'd in the Septuagint Greek. In fact, the tax collector's prayer is nothing less than an echo of Old Testament passages like Psalms 65:3, where the psalmist cries out, "Iniquities overwhelm me. Only you can kaphar for our rebellions." This Judaized Greek use of hilaskomai is thus a seamless match for Hebrew's use of kaphar. Jesus wasn't telling a story where the wrathful and vindictive Yahweh of the Old Testament was now letting sin slide and deciding to be merciful. Jesus wasn't saying anything new about God here. He was redirecting people to God's power to purify and purge sin, themes that the Old Testament always spoke of. The second and final use of hilaskomai in the New Testament is in Hebrews 2:17. The author writes, "Therefore Jesus had to be like his brothers and sisters in every way, so that he could become a merciful and faithful high priest in matters pertaining to God, to make atonement for the sins of the people." The phrase "make atonement for" here in the Christian Standard Bible translation is, once again, our friend hilaskomai. This phrase "make atonement for" matches how the CSB translates kaphar in the Old Testament. What's interesting here, though, is what is absent in the original Greek. This is going to get a little bit nerdy for a second, but hang with me. The CSB translation says that Jesus would make atonement for the sins of the people. We would expect hilaskomai to translate "make atonement," but the CSB translates it "make atonement for," adding the preposition "for." Greek has separate words for prepositions, just like we do in English. Typically, the Greek equivalent of "for" would be the word "anti." So if Jesus were to make atonement for sins, we would expect the Greek to read something like that Jesus would hilaskomai anti-sins. This is actually the phrasing that the Septuagint uses in Leviticus when a priest makes atonement for someone. But here in Hebrews, anti does not appear in the text. It just says that Jesus became a high priest to hilaskomai the sin of the people. Sin itself is what hilaskomai acts upon in this passage. Sin is the direct object of hilaskomai here, in other words, the very thing that we suspected from studying Levitical sacrifice. Remember, in Leviticus, Kaphar never actually had a direct object, but we determined from context that sin was the most likely implied direct object. It was probably the thing that Kaphar was acting upon. Based upon the author here in Hebrews, it would seem that we were on the right track. The CSB is more correct than other translations here, but it could be better if it said something like Jesus purged the sins of the people. He didn't act for or because of sin. He acted on sin directly. It's right there in the grammar. Now, if you read this passage in some of the English versions that are touted as being, quote, more literal and supposedly therefore more truthful, like the ESV, the NASB, or the New King James, they actually mistakenly insert the classical Greek use of hilaskomai into this passage, and they read something like, Jesus became a high priest to make propitiation for the people, rather than the language of saying that Jesus would make atonement for the sins of the people. Versions like the NIV, the NLT, and actually even the original King James join the CSB and avoid this propitiation language altogether by one method or another. If you read the highly respected ESV specifically, you may notice that the word atone or atonement never once appears in its entire rendition of the New Testament. The translators completely washed the New Testament of any trace of Levitical language by doing this. In its place is the pagan Greek language of propitiation or appeasement. The translators made the error of using Homer's dictionary rather than Moses's dictionary to define hilaskomai. The difference this error makes cannot be overstated. In pagan sacrificial logic, the deities demand satisfaction. They demand to be appeased. They demand propitiation. And they demand blood to do so. They demand death as an end in itself. By contrast, Hebrew sacrificial logic teaches us that Yahweh can repurpose death as the very means of spreading life and undoing the pollution of sin and death. Yahweh provides purification for his people in the Old Testament, rather than demanding propitiation from them. Pagans thought the gods needed to be appeased. In their world, the gods were the issue. The Hebrews learned instead that sin was the issue, and that Yahweh provided a means of dealing with it. In Hebrew logic, Yahweh is the solution, not the problem. Translations like the ESV force readers to never read that story. In its place is the skewed, westernized, and frankly paganized medieval gospel that says, we sinned, God killed Jesus instead, and now we're all in the clear. Rather than the true gospel message of a loving, daring, heroic, triune God, united in the mission of restoring, purifying, and liberating a lost and enslaved humanity. All that said, between these two verses, we have a tax collector that gets hilaskomai or kaphared, and the sins of the people that get hilaskomai or kaphared. Both uses are a perfect match for what we would expect from what we have learned from the Old Testament. Now, just for completeness' sake, one caveat I will give to my interpretation here is that the Septuagint does use hilaskomai alongside that intensified form of exilaskomai. Exilaskomai seems to be the word that is reserved as the direct stand-in for kaphar, and regular old hilaskomai seems to have a less intense meaning, like pardoning rather than atoning. Exilaskomai specifically never appears in the New Testament. So it is possible that the New Testament authors were leaning more so on pardoning language than atoning language. If so, perhaps the tax collector in Luke was asking God to pardon him, and Jesus would have pardoned the sins of the people in Hebrews. In my mind, it makes little difference which interpretation you go with. The point is that these passages are still not about propitiation or appeasement in any form. Neither atonement nor pardoning is about appeasing God or satisfying his wrath. It's all about God doing something for the benefit of a human. The gospel is absolutely not about propitiation, because the Old Testament wasn't ever about propitiation either. The Old Testament teaches us that sin needs to be purged, not that God's wrath needs to be satisfied. Jesus is presented as the solution to that Old Testament problem. This leaves us with one final question. If the Judaized meaning of hilaskomai was so clear, why did the New Testament authors use that word so infrequently? Why does it only appear twice in the entire New Testament? My suspicion is that it was because the New Testament authors were very well aware that they were writing to Greeks who were used to using a Greek dictionary definition of hilaskomai, not a Jewish definition. The two uses of hilaskomai that we see here in the New Testament were both used among a Jewish audience. Jesus' parable in Luke was told to Jews who also spoke the Judaized Greek of the Septuagint. Hebrews was expressly written to, well, Hebrews. Again, Jews who were used to speaking in the Judaized Greek of the Septuagint. By contrast, hilaskomai is never once used when Gentiles are the primary audience of the author. The only exceptions to this rule is that some of the noun forms of hilaskomai, words like hilasterion or hilasmos, are occasionally used in letters that may have had Gentiles in their audience. Hilasterion is used once in Romans, and hilasmos is used twice in the letter of 1 John. But apart from that, the use of explicit Judaized Greek references to Leviticus are absent in communication with Gentiles. Instead, the New Testament authors wove the unmistakable results of Kaphar or hilaskomai into their narratives. Levitical language is there, just in a different form. The New Testament is shot through with words like purification, transformation, and so forth. And those who were trained by the stories and language of the Old Testament would have immediately connected that kind of language to Leviticus. But those who were not familiar with Leviticus would have still been able to get the basic meanings immediately. I suspect that this technique of saying hilaskomai without using the word hilaskomai was employed precisely because the Jewish New Testament authors knew that they, as Jews, used hilaskomai so differently than most Gentiles. The fact that they instead described the results of their Judaized version of hilaskomai in so many places without saying the specific word hilaskomai, to me is compelling evidence that they did not want anyone to make the mistake of thinking that Jesus was here to make propitiation or to appease an angry deity. He was here to kaphar. He was here to deal with sin. It's a deft move, really. Where Jews were the primary audience, the authors of the New Testament used the language of the Greek Septuagint and relied upon the full force of the Hebrew that it represented. Where Gentiles were the primary audience, the New Testament authors went to great lengths to use vocabulary that would minimize confusion. It reflects Paul's attitude that he would make himself all things to all people that he might save some. But no matter who was in the audience, the key focus of all of the New Testament authors was that Jesus had conquered the powers, purified us from our sins, and that we are invited to reject the powers of darkness and take up a new vocation as true humans and become a royal priesthood, restored to membership in God's family at last. They presented him as the solution to all the problems defined in the Old Testament. So there you have it. When you read your New Testament, do it with a Hebrew dictionary, not a pagan Greek one. The Bible is seamless from one end to the other when you read it with the right background. But that's all for now. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, go in the peace of God.